At the end of August, Zhukov was within easy reach of Warsaw on the Central Front, where the Polish Home Army, loyal to the government in exile in London, rose against the German occupiers in the mistaken belief that the Russians were about to arrive. Elsewhere in Poland, this 300,000-strong army, well organized, had been fighting earlier in the year in support of the Russian advance. Its commander, General Komorowski, issued a proclamation on the 1st of August, copies of which were printed by the thousand. Addressing the people as soldiers of the city, he issued orders for everyone to fight against the German invader, to take up arms openly to restore the freedom of their country, and to punish the German criminals for the terror and bestiality they had committed within their frontiers. He did so in the belief that the Russians, already within field artillery range, would join in the fight and help in the liberation of the capital. It would have been easy for them to do so, for the Germans in Warsaw were initially taken by surprise, and the Home Army captured many key buildings. Instead, in an act of cynical treachery almost beyond belief, the Russians halted before the gates of the Polish capital, ostensibly to replenish, as the SS and Gestapo went into Warsaw to settle with Komorowski's gallant citizen soldiers, who as non-communists were left to fight to the death. General Bohr had provisioned for no more than a week's fighting, on the assumption that once it started, the Russians would come to his rescue. There is abundant evidence that whilst the fighting in Warsaw went on, a degree of fraternization existed between German units defending the line of the river Vistula and the Russians on the far bank. It should also be borne in mind that the latter were exhausted by several months of unremitting combat, had greatly overstretched their logistics system, and needed up to a month's respite in which to service worn-out equipment, obtain badly needed reinforcements, and rehearse the inevitable river crossings that lay ahead. In Warsaw itself, the battle reached new levels of savagery, when it became clear to the Poles that their allies were not going to help them. The German officer in charge of the ruthless street-clearing operation, Gruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski of the SS, had his orders. The Poles were to be exterminated. Offers by the British and Americans to fly supplies to the beleaguered Poles were refused by the Soviets, who denied the RAF and the US Air Force the use of airfields on which to refuel. Bach-Zelewski assumed command when the Warsaw Rebellion had been underway for nearly a week, and the Poles were almost, it seemed, on the point of vanquishing the German garrison. So confident indeed that the various political factions within the Home Army, gleefully using much captured German equipment, were already beginning to fight each other. The decision to deploy the SS was a conscious one. It freed conventional army units to deploy on the line of the Vistula to face the impending Russian assault, and it was an ominous sign that no quarter was to be given to Komorowski's army. Bach-Zelewski's SS men were an unsavory mix of Russian ex-prisoners and other turncoats, and convicts from German jails, taking the chance of winning remission through good conduct in battle. They pitched into the Home Army with merciless gusto. Even so, the SS found the going tough. The Poles had already been supplied with British weapons and ammunition airdropped earlier in the year, and they now had much captured German equipment. Despite the Russians' bloody-minded refusal to grant refueling facilities, a few RAF aircraft managed to reach Warsaw with small loads and drop them by night to the Poles. As the battle continued, reports of the atrocious behavior of the SS were circulating in the General Staff. Several senior generals, notably Heinz Guderian, actually remonstrated to the Führer, in itself an act of moral courage. Even Bach-Zelewski was uneasy over the barbarism of some of his subordinates. Well may he have been, for it was dawning on many of his kind that the Allies were going to win, and would be calling to account any German officers who had been involved with offences against the rules of war. He therefore agreed to meet General Bohr, and a truce was agreed. The fighting had lasted for 2 months. In addition to 15,000 Home Army dead, at least 200,000 civilians had perished. On surrendering, the surviving Poles were, strangely enough, granted prisoner of war status by the Germans and marched off into prison camps that all too soon would be in Russian hands, and from which only a handful would emerge alive. As the Poles fought in vain for their capital, the Russian advance continued to the south. Until the beginning of August 1944, the German Army Group South Ukraine had been granted a quiet summer. It was, however, only a shadow of its former strength. 5 armoured and 4 infantry divisions had been transferred elsewhere, and the remainder had been badly affected by casualties to men and material. To make matters worse, Germany's weaker partners in the Axis were beginning to fall. The Romanians were contemplating changing sides, joining the Russians, and suing the Allies for acceptable peace terms. On the 20th of August, the storm broke. The Russian Second Ukrainian Front struck south, as the Fourth Ukrainian Front headed west from its bridgeheads on the river Dniester, near Kishinev. The First and Fourth Ukrainian fronts drove west towards the river Vistula, which they reached at the end of the month, halting on its banks as their logistic tail, left far behind in the precipitate advance, caught up. The respite offered little comfort to what remained of Army Group Centre defending the river line. Behind them lay 250 miles of the plains of Poland, offering little or no comfort to the defenders, but ideal country for the advancing Russians, where massed formations of armoured vehicles could range freely. The next river defence line available to the Germans was that of the Oder, and behind that, a bare 50 miles distant, Berlin itself. The German army was now a shadow of its former self. In dead, wounded, sick and captured, it was to suffer almost 2 million casualties in the year ending December 1944, and the supply of fit men to replace these seasoned troops had dried up. Whole divisions had actually disappeared from the German army order of battle, but Hitler, who refused to acknowledge facts that displeased him, insisted that newly raised divisions of so-called People's Grenadiers bore the designations of those that had been effectively destroyed, mostly in the east. The new formations, lacking heavy weapons or armour and well below the manning levels of those they replaced, were assigned to the German Home Army under command of Heinrich Himmler, Chief of the Gestapo or Secret Police, and now Minister of the Interior, to which post he was appointed after the failure of the assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944. After his narrow escape from the bomb placed under the conference table at Rastenburg, Hitler became even more paranoid, insisting that only the Nazi salute was to be given and the old one abolished. Despite their growing unease at the way in which the war was being directed by the Führer and his close associates, the General Staff, including Germany's proven soldiers like Guderian, Manstein and their contemporaries, conformed. They were warned of the perils of doing otherwise by the fate of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who, suspected of implication in the assassination attempt, was given the choice of facing a people's court and a degrading execution, or suicide and a soldier's funeral. He took the latter. Hitler still relied for military advice on Field Marshals Keitel and Jodl, respectively Chief and Chief of Staff of the German Armed Forces, or OKW.